Okay, welcome everyone. With a little bit of delay, we can start this kickoff. We can kick off this session on facing the megatrends, spatial justice and just transition. My name is Joachim Maas. I work for the European Commission, DG Regio, in also the unit that organizes this conference, or the unit on policy development and economic analysis. I worked there since 1 year. Before, I was a scientist at the Joint Research Center, mainly working on biodiversity. Clearly, leaving no one behind, as stated before, is a key objective of the European Green Deal. As soon as the von der Leyen Commission entered into force in 2019, the European Green Deal was launched in soon after, clearly with also the target of a just transition to climate neutrality, and then hence taken also up in the cohesion policy. So the discussions on today focus on this just transition. We have 3 speakers today, actually 4 speakers. We start the session with Sarah. After that, we have Mike, and then Mikko and Michael. We have 1.5 hours. There's only 3 presentations, so you will have 20 minutes each to present. After each presentation, I just open the floor for 1 or 2 technical or specific questions that you might have, and otherwise we have a common discussion also later. Sort of interest. I'm fairly interested also to understand, and already mentioned before in the plenary, how can we ensure that also in the next cohesion policy we leave no one behind? What is the effectiveness of the current instruments? Is there a risk for fragmentation? So these are the kind of questions that I would also like to address with you after this session. So I now then invite Sarah Kaitsuka to the floor. She is a PhD student at the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds. Sarah.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. So I'll be presenting on my paper on just transition. Excuse me, with the presentation. Oh, this one? Second one. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Oh. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. So my paper is titled Just Transition, How to Leave No One Behind, a lesson from comparative analysis of the British coal mines and the Croatian oil refinery. To start off with, the definition of a just transition, according to the European Commission, as mentioned before, is a transition towards a climate neutral economy, but with a caveat that it happens in a fair way, leaving no one behind. And some of the policy implications from that is that it needs to be a place-based interventions to minimize negative socioeconomic impacts stemming from transition into a sustainable economy. So the concept of the just transition itself actually has a fairly old background. So it derives from the 1980s trade union movement within the United States. At this moment in time, it was predominantly as a move against the people losing jobs from the manufacturing sector and then transitioning into the service sector. However, fast forward to present, the terminology just transition has expanded to include the replacement of non-green jobs and into transition into green jobs. So in terms of the kind of specific features that the green jobs have, they tend to have be non-routine tasks, require formal education and on-the-job training. So it does imply that people would need to have a higher level of human capital in order to make the most of the green jobs. There's also been talks about how there needs to be more local level support and having key stakeholders being involved in order to make this transition a success. So going to the question of who's actually responsible for just transition, previous studies have found that EU citizens are capable of placing responsibility depending on the policy area. So for instance, if your healthcare system is nationalized, they'll be more likely to perceive the national government as being responsible, and therefore they are able to differentiate between who's responsible for each policy area. And also decentralization has been found to have greater positive economic impact, whether that's economic growth or a fairer economy, and therefore decentralization is also quite key. And going back to the previous statement, people are still capable of placing responsibility where they are the greatest. However, the caveat to this is that people need to be well informed constantly in order to make a good judgment as well. Okay, so in terms of the areas I'm focusing on, I don't know if you can tell from my accent, I'm actually situated in Yorkshire. So that's why that circle is showing Wakefield region, which is in West Yorkshire. As you can see, it's in a centralized location. And then the comparison that I wanted to do was with Sisak in Croatia, which is located there. Now, I'd like to caveat that this paper has been mainly presented from my own thesis, which focused on Wakefield specifically. So Sisak would, with the case of Sisak, I'll be trying to extract some lessons that can be learned from the case of Wakefield rather than a direct comparison. Okay, so in terms of some of the similarities, both regions are carbon-intensive, place-based industries. With the case of Sisak in Croatia, they used to have an oil refinery. Now it has closed down, and now they're trying to transition into biorefinery. In the case of Wakefield, it used to be a traditional coal mining area, and it has also been quite reliant on this mono industry for a long time. Both regions face issues in the sense of skills and education qualification levels, which tend to be a bit lower than the national average. Key differences are stated there, but I think that with some of the similarities there, I can extract some of the lessons that can be learned from the case of Wakefield. So in terms of just transition, I think with the previous studies that has been done with the original intention of from people losing their jobs and then being retrained or re-educated into new jobs, I think we can apply this to the just transition from non-green jobs. Probably people become unemployed, then they'll need to be retrained and then gain green jobs. So it's sort of policy. The process is a linear process. And in terms of policy implications, you have perhaps different policy interventions at each stage of this linear progress. What I would say is that having these disparate policies would mean that it would be quite likely that people will be falling between the cracks between these in each transition process. So focusing on the point of unemployment, I don't think I'll be very new to say that they have quite substantive negative impacts. But the most important thing that these negative impacts of unemployment tends to be multi-generational, as in if the previous generation of the family becomes unemployed, it is less likely for you to find a job as well. And the period of having unemployment means that you'll be losing key skills, as well as you'll be more reliant on higher human capital, such as skills and networks. So these are the kinds of caveats that exist, and therefore I'd argue that the linear process of non-green jobs to becoming unemployed, successful retraining, and then becoming re-employed in green sectors is going to be quite a challenge. So I'll skip this bit just for now. Okay, so going to Wakefield as a case study, it closed 16 total mines, but the majority of this 11 mines were closed between the 1980s and the 1990s, resulting in substantive job losses and population decline. It has started to improve in terms of population, which is growing at the moment, but we are seeing an aging population at the moment. So the important thing is that the jobs that came after the mine closures, they tended to be low paid, low skilled, tended to be routine work, and mostly found in the logistics sector. And this is because Wakefield is situated in the middle of the country, and therefore it has been identified that probably would prosper with a focus on logistics sector. But that also means that there's lack of skills and lack of diverse opportunities. We also have limited re-education opportunities because we don't have any universities in the area. If you want to go to university, you're more likely to move out or commute long distances. And we have Wakefield College, which does offer degree level apprenticeships, but these positions tend to be quite minimal in scale. And I'd like to point out that despite the image of coal mining as being an arduous work and probably quite poor, they tended to pay quite well in the past. So it was the second highest median pay as of 1980 for full-time male workers in the manufacturing sector. So I'd like to point out that the kind of jobs that people lost weren't necessarily just bad or arduous. It was relatively well paid for the region, and therefore the shock of the new jobs that came to be, which tended to be lower skills, had a devastating impact as well. Okay, so I'd like to also focus on the acrimonious relationships between key stakeholders. We've been talking about the importance of key stakeholders having an aligned interest. In the case of Wakefield, during the 1980s, Thatcher government and the National Coal Board had the intention of closing the mines, potentially supporting people who become unemployed, retrain them, and then help them into re-employment. However, the National Union of Miners, which was the trade unions, disagreed with this and wanted to keep all mines open regardless of its economic capacity, and therefore save coal mining jobs. I also like to point out with the Thatcher government, they were quite interested in entrepreneurships, meaning that they wanted to invest in people becoming entrepreneurs in the area, which was quite a difficulty considering the fact that a lot of people didn't have formal qualifications, didn't have the necessary social networks, and the kind of skills development that they were offered tended to be lower skilled. The support for former coal mining communities did come, but with a caveat that it came quite late. Most of these projects came in the 1990s. So the first 4 are specifically from the UK, and this was offered during the New Labour government rather than the Thatcher government or the subsequent major government, which were both Conservative governments. ReCHAR was an EU program. This tried to funnel both the European Social Funds and European Regional Development Funds into the coal mining sectors, and this had some levels of success, but the fact that it came at a delayed time after a couple of years after the mine closures meant that its impact was to be limited. So the kind of the key points of lessons that could be learned from the case of Wakefield is the fact that when key stakeholders don't have an aligned goal, this can have detrimental impacts in order to support the individuals. Lack of recognition that coal mining industries and communities needed specific support meant that holistic support was non-existent in the case of Wakefield. Delayed responses that came in the 1990s also meant that there were some limitations in what it could have achieved. So in the case of CISAC Croatia, it has a relatively high unemployment rate. To start off with 90%, it is much higher than the national average. And also it's a rapidly aging and declining population. And in terms of the oil refinery, it peaked in 1980s. The operating company is the INA. It's private, it has been privatized, but 45% of it is still nationally owned. So there is some scope of the government interventions. And now, after the oil refinery closure, it is trying to be converted to a biorefinery. In terms of higher education providers, it's quite limited. As far as I can see, there's only one faculty, which is the Faculty of Metallurgy of the University of Zagreb, located in Sisak. It has about 29 people graduating per year, 141 students. It's the smallest faculty within the University of Zagreb. So there's limitations in what the higher education providers can do in order to re-educate and retrain the population. Logistics has actually been identified by consultancy firms as a way to move forward. However, I'd like to also point out that in the case of Wakefield, a quite substantive proportion of the residents are employed in the logistics sector, but they are having difficulties due to, as I said before, low pay, lack of skills, limited career prospects, and also the dangerous mechanization. So now we are talking about these jobs potentially being automated, and again, a cycle of the loss of jobs that we'll be potentially be seeing. So coming back to the just transition process from non-green jobs to becoming unemployed, but successfully being retrained and then entering into green jobs is going to be quite difficult. And instead, this is not the most well-developed process that I've come up with. And I'd like to ask the audience for some feedback, comments in order to how to improve. I'd say that the main stakeholders, you should have the key main stakeholders having an aligned goal of interest. So I put businesses there, but in the case of in both countries with business interests, also in the national government interest will be quite important. Probably in order to transition from non-green jobs to retraining, they should have been done at the same time. So while people are still being employed in these non-green sectors, they should have been retrained and re-educated. If this wasn't the case, perhaps some kind of maintenance loans to support people during their education. And then in order to transition to green jobs, identifying the fact that CISAC has relatively limited other job prospects, perhaps it would be wise to support people in moving out of the region potentially, and then supporting them through providing accommodation and transportation support as well. This was actually the case that was done in the case of my home country, Japan, where we did give out some funds to former coal miners in order for them to move out of the region to gain re-employment. So lastly, I'd like to point out the political consequence of inaction. So Wakefield voted quite substantively in support for Brexit. 66.4% of its residents did vote in support. And while the residents didn't actually view the EU as having been directly responsible for the relative decline, it is also a sign that if these kinds of socioeconomic damages aren't fully addressed, that it could have a wider political consequence, not just at the local level, but at the national level. For instance, they voted, thank you, they voted for the Conservative Party for the first time in 80 years. So while I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad, it is a sign of a seismic move or in terms of the political landscape, and therefore a failed just transition has the potential of having a long-term, wider consequences. So in terms of the conclusion, I'll say that the failed just transition has caused a long-term relative decline in the case of Wakefield. And as in the previous session, Alessandra mentioned that we need to be looking into more of the endemic kind of challenges that local authorities face. This is definitely the case of Wakefield. Some of the kind of interventions, for instance, trying to encourage entrepreneurship, had quite limited impact due to the existing difficulties in terms of skills and education qualifications, and also considering the negative impact of unemployment and its long-term consequences, perhaps intervene as early as possible while people are still in employment in a declining sector would be quite important. And also that all stakeholders, key stakeholders, should have an aligned, at least short-term goal as well. And also there's a limited role at the moment in regions like Wakefield or CISAC in these regions for the higher education sector to play. And therefore we need to recognize these difficulties and challenges. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity.
Stay a little bit, because on second thought, I mean, having a common discussion, the room is not really suitable for that as now. I mean, I can't invite all the speakers to the stage, it's just too small. So if you have more than just specific questions for Sarah, then we can have just a few minutes to raise them up. Any reactions from the audience? Yes, please.
Thank you very much.
There's a microphone behind you. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Milad Abbas from the University of Groningen. I found this transition from non-green to green jobs very interesting. I'm wondering whether you have a narrative or an example from your case, how it happened, how it worked out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So for in the case of Wakefield, it was quite difficult to find them being able to transition successfully into green job sectors. And of course, it happened at first back in the 1980s and 1990s when we were still not talking about these green jobs. But I think that the difficulty in people finding new job opportunities, especially when you need to have higher levels of education qualifications, skill sets, longer term training, means that it's quite unlikely that people will be able to successfully make that transition unless there's substantive intervention. So I think that's the kind of lesson that can be learned and applied to the transition from non-green to green jobs. Thank you.
I have a question myself. So, I mean, I think it's very interesting for cohesion policy to learn from the examples of the past. And I also reckon that in the 80s and 90s, when across Europe coal mines have been shut down, there were no sort of green jobs to replace them, and now we do have them. Anyway, I like your scheme that you presented and on which we could reflect. I'm come from Belgium. We had a coal mine region called Limburg on the border with the Netherlands and Germany in the east of the country, which was then also closed in the 80s and 90s. And one way of sort of institutionalizing the stakeholder component of your scheme was to apply what we called an intendant, so a person or a small group of people that actually tries to engage and bring together all the different stakeholders to come to a consensus. So I mean, with mixed outcomes, of course, because you need to first gain trust of all the parties, and if you are a government representative who has shut down the coal mines, you don't necessarily have that. Maybe any experiences on such an approach in the UK or in the Croatian region?
Yeah, Thank you so much for that. The example of Belgium was very interesting, and I think that in terms of Wakefield, at least, there wasn't that much cooperation, as you point out. The government was seen as the ones responsible for having closed down the coal mines, and the National Coal Board was also responsible for operating the mines, were also seen as responsible for not having had. There were speculations that the head of the National Coal Board was too close to the national government, and with the trade unions movements, they were also able to go with that narrative, which made it extremely difficult for any kind of cooperation. So in the case of Wakefield and the wider coal mining communities of that time, that kind of cooperations, I don't think happened, or was quite difficult because of the personal clashes at the very top. In case of CISAC, the trade union communities seems to be having a less prominence. I think it's happening in all of the world, but trade unions are losing their memberships and losing their political influence as well. So they have been petitioning to try to stop the coal mine, the oil refinery closures, or people being made redundant. But it seems that they've had fairly limited influence in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for a very nice presentation. And I would like to pick up, my name is Michael Kuhl, I'm from the Natural Resources Institute, Finland. On your point on education, I found that very interesting and relevant. Also, we are soon presenting a paper on the Just Transition Fund in Finland, and there one of the issues that the DG Radio was looking at was the kind of the quality of re-education, or is there enough capacity of re-education for the people? In our case, it's the peat sector. And but primarily then what they were looking at was not at the level of higher education as you presented, but at the level of University of Applied Sciences, but also vocational schools. And then my question would be, how did you also look at that aspect? And the second point, in my previous work, I was working for the Nordic Collaboration, so Nordic Council of Ministers, in very remote places like Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And I found very interesting aspects of kind of remote education, and also in the higher sector. So in the Faroe Islands, very remote from the capital, Tórshavn, and they had some agreements with University of Copenhagen for education, providing education in the remotest islands. So is that also some kind of issue that you might think could be implemented? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, the question. Actually, I didn't talk about this in this presentation, but actually vocation training was something that I was quite interested in as well. So the problem with the UK's vocational system is that it tends to have been quite difficult in terms of people getting that experience. So at present, we actually have maintenance loans for students going into the higher education sector. So regardless of your background, you are able to get this government loan in order to gain a university level education. The problem with the vocational system is that it doesn't exist, and we expect that people will be paid for their time because you are working part-time and studying part-time. The problem here is that with the vocational system in the UK, the minimum wage is £4, about £4 per hour. That's half the minimum wage that of a normal worker. And I've made some very simple calculations based on if you are residing in Wakefield and if you try to live on your own, based on that income for the number of hours, the minimum hours of work that you'll be doing, you'll probably be left with a couple of pounds at best to survive on, which is not enough. And therefore, it's quite likely that you need to have your friends and family supporting you during your time of apprenticeships. It's almost impossible for a person to be doing a vocational training while living on their own. You have to have that kind of family support. And increasingly, we are seeing vocational training where people are applying for them tend to be quite old. So the highest increase in the number of people starting vocational training is at age 25 or older. So it's quite likely that these people have already gone through some kind of educational qualification or some kind of work and then going into these kind of training programs. So we're not seeing people who are 16, 17 just left compulsory education and joining these institutions. So there is a problem in terms of the available opportunities. And another point is that vocational training tends to be seen as relatively easy for people with limited academic background, but we have a minimum requirement of certain GCSE scores, which is the scores for high school students. And if you don't meet that minimum score, you can't even get on to become a plumber. In the Wakefield region, quite substantive number of people actually don't meet that basic requirement. So from before you get to that vocational training stage, students are being let down by the current education system in order to achieve that basic qualification. So we do have quite a bit of issues there. And in the point about being rural, Wakefield is quite rural, but I think compared to the other regions, it's relatively well connected. So that's my final point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And best of luck with your PhD. There's water if you need a drink, so take it here. So our next speaker is Professor Mike Woods. He is a professor of human geography at the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences in Aberystwyth. Do I pronounce that correctly? That's in Wales. And he will speak about spatial justice and territorial cohesion in Europe, scenarios for 2050.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I find it here we are. Good. Yeah, so I'm thinking that in many ways I'm going to be building on some of the discussions in the plenary this morning. In fact, our starting point for this talk is, as we all know, that territorial cohesion is enshrined as a core principle for the European Union, and that there has been uneven and discontinuous patterns of convergence, and that also we're seeing more recently some of the principles underlying territorial cohesion and cohesion policy are being challenged by Eurosceptic, populist, and separatist movements, such that the future of territorial cohesion in the European Union cannot be taken for granted. So in this presentation, I want to just briefly introduce a spatial justice perspective on territorial cohesion as a way of looking at this, to take stock of the current position, and then to outline 4 scenarios for territorial cohesion and spatial justice in the EU of 2050. I'm drawing here upon a recently completed Horizon 2020 project, Imagine, which is focused on addressing territorial inequalities and spatial justice in Europe. This was a consortium of 15 partners, including MICO, amongst others, as an interdisciplinary project with a number of different foci in work packages and a mixed methods approach to our evidence and analysis. And in this talk this morning, I'm going to draw a little bit on some of the economic analysis which was done, to also draw upon the panel survey, which had just over 18,000 respondents across 8 different European countries, but mainly to draw upon this final box here of the scenario development and training. But let me start by saying a bit more about spatial justice as the lens through which we explored this issue. And I've taken a definition here from one of our sibling projects in the same call under Horizon 2020, Relocal, and they define spatial justice as being about focusing on both the just geographic distribution of resources and opportunities and on the power relations that cause injustice between social groups and between spaces. So as a concept, spatial justice has roots both in the radical urban geography of writers such as David Harvey and ideas of territorial justice in the late 1960s and 1970s, and then in Henri Lefebvre's concept of the right to city. It has since then been largely developed in an urban context, notably by Ed Soldier in the United States, But more recently, we've been seeing this application to regional scale context, and partly driven by this particular Horizon 2020 call. In part because it's had this bifurcated origins, spatial justice isn't necessarily a unified theory, but has different, slightly different perspectives embodied within it. And one of the things we did in the Imagine project was try to expand the concept of spatial justice and to elaborate a multidimensional model as identified here. So the different dimensions we have within this. Firstly, that spatial justice perhaps its most simplistic level is about the distribution of resources across geographical space, but it's also about the fairness of policy and decision-making processes that produce those distributions. In other words, the spatial distribution of power. It's additionally about the capability of an individual or social group to participate in the processes that shape space and exert an influence over the production of the spaces in which they spend their everyday lives. And this is the kind of Lefebvrean idea of the right to the city or the right to the region as we've expanded it. But spatial justice also takes us from a quantitative measurement of inequalities to a qualitative assessment of what is just, what is fair. And that therefore brings in the dimension of perception. So spatial justice is also about perceived inequalities or perceived fairness, unfairness across and between spaces, which may or may not correspond to quantitative measurements of observed material distributions. And finally, we can also see spatial justice as a normative idea, not just describing whether something is or is not just, but also articulating what justice might look like. So when we apply this across to looking at territorial inequalities within the EU at present and the impacts of cohesion policy, we can come up with a number of conclusions. So firstly, we've found that there was a discernible trajectory of narrowing disparities between regions in Europe over the last 3 decades, but with a number of caveats. And these, again, are not necessarily new. I think they're reinforcing much of the evidence which in the 8th cohesion report, for example. But that firstly, that we saw a very clear trend of convergence up to 2008. It was disrupted by the economic crisis, and it's taken time to recover. So the last decade, we've seen a far more heterogeneous pattern of convergence of that period. Secondly, that convergence has been most pronounced in a closing of middle ranking regions, rather than at the extremes, the most and least affluent regions. And we do identify with that some emerging pockets of persistent disadvantage. And thirdly, that the closing of within region inequalities has frequently been slower than reductions in between region disparities. So this again raises the question of scale, which is touched on the plenary. And just one illustration of this, one item of work within Imagine was to disaggregate some of the data from NUTS2 down to the local scales. Well, that local scale data wasn't necessarily equivalently available across the European Union. And this, for example, shows mean household income disaggregated to local scale. And you see, you can compare that to the figures at NUTS2 regions. You get a much more granulated pattern here, including rural-urban distinctions. Second key finding, European territorial cohesion policies have had an impact in narrowing interregional inequalities. But again, the effect of specific instruments is variegated geographically and over time. So higher levels of structural funds investment, for example, are associated with the pre-2004 states, with narrowing of inequalities within regions, but had less impact on regional economic growth. In the post-2004 states, on the other hand, we see a positive influence on regional economic growth, but also exacerbation of within region inequalities. And we also additionally note that it's not just European Union policy here. National fiscal transfer policies have also been important, but again, have differential impacts. Thirdly, public perceptions of inequalities between regions and relative economic development or quality of services are not always consistent with quantitative indicators. And we picked this up through the panel survey we did of these 8 countries here. So one of the questions we asked was whether respondents considered that their region had benefited more or less than other regions from European funding. And on the map on the left there, the pinks and the purples and the oranges are the regions where over half respondents said that their region had benefited less from EU funding than other EU regions. And what stands out there is that includes regions in parts of Poland, in Romania, in southern Italy, in parts of Spain, which actually are amongst the highest level of regions in terms of structural fund eligibility. Fourth, there's broad public support for the principle of solidarity between regions, but also with significant national and regional variations. So the preferences for the scale at which solidarity is exercised vary and are influenced by perceptions of deservingness of recipient regions, perceptions of political competence and corruption and so on. And this then helps to shape these ideas of spatial injustice and whether or not regions feel they're being treated fairly, both in terms of the support they get from cohesion policy, but also in terms of the contributions they're making to cohesion policy and where that funding is ending up. And those perceptions of spatial justice you see feeding through into support for populist, Eurosceptic and territorial autonomy movements, which then presents a challenge to ideas of solidarity and cohesion at a European scale and the capacities for redistribution. This is again from the panel survey. We asked whether the priority should be on helping other regions within the same country, other lagging regions within the European Union as a whole, or on a global scale, less developed countries globally. And what we see here is a higher levels for transfers within the European Union in countries like Romania and Spain and Italy. But you then look at the UK, you look at Germany and France, and especially the Netherlands, which stands out here. The preference is very much for keeping that support within the nation state, the member state. And on the question of how this feeds into territorial autonomy movements, we look more at territorial autonomy movements rather than Eurosceptic movements. But this was looking at how they frame their demands and documentation. And in some, we see it's about socioeconomic inequality emphasized, but in others, generally the wealthier regions, Catalonia, Bavaria, Northern Italy, Northern Italy and Bavaria in particular in this one, it was about political arguments, about political justice, including arguments fiscal autonomy and holding on to their own wealth. So where does this take us looking forward? So building on that kind of research we did looking at the current state of territorial inequality and special justice in Europe, we then started to project ahead what this might look like over the next 4 EU planning rounds. So that takes you on 7-year periods to 2048, and we, for this presentation, rounded that up to 2050. We did this with a participating scenario building methodology, starting with a virtual working group of members of our consortium who've been involved in different areas of the work. And from this, we elaborated, identified the kind of political ecosystem and the issues we just did, identified 2 axes, and then populating and elaborating each of these 4 resulting scenarios. We then went out to various foresight experts in a number of different institutions and tested in workshops with, again, a further other institutions, both in Europe and elsewhere. We had workshops with regional and national level stakeholders and external reviews by 16 experts in different fields to elaborate these scenarios. And then with the final versions, we've also then gone back to workshops in Greece, Ireland, Poland, so Romania and Wales, with, again, regional and national stakeholders and discussing the implications and applications of the scenarios. So this is what we've got in terms of scenarios. We've got it along 2 axes, and these axes are both continuums rather than opposites, but one is between a high level of solidarity and centralization in Europe, underpinning European politics, and the other is high levels of regional autonomy. And then the horizontal axis is between an emphasis wholly on economic growth and prosperity at one end, and at the other end, a broader emphasis on social and environmental well-being, in which economic growth is relegated as less significant. And from that, we then populated these scenarios in the 4 corners, which I'll just take you through now. So the Silver Citadel scenario is one which perhaps feels most familiar to us now. It's one in which actually you managed to achieve not only greater prosperity, but also more economic equity by 2050. But that's happened through the consolidation of decision-making power and even more centralized structures underpinning territorial cohesion. That includes a unified EU tax and welfare system. Material inequalities have therefore receded, leveling ahead of GDP and supported by AU, use of artificial intelligence. And in this, we're driving towards spatial justice as understood as the equitable distribution of wealth between regions. But at the same time, there's perceptions of spatial injustice where the centralization of decision making is seen to have excluded individuals from regions from making control decisions over their own resources and taxation and so on. In the second scenario, we again see the EU consolidating its powers to monitor and regulate resilience and sustainability to survive the climate change and other crises. We imagine a Europe that's been quite significantly disrupted here, sea level change leaving some coastal regions being abandoned, cities perhaps falling out of favor because of repeated pandemics, rural areas becoming more valued, and therefore European structural funds are no longer distributed according to GDP, but an assessment of social and environmental threats and needs and success measured by a range of well-being indicators. Common agricultural policy has been replaced by common food and health policy, there's climate reparations, and here spatial justice means regions helping each other to adapt and change. So the institutional coherence of the EU regions has been strengthened through centralization of decision-making, but new significant territorial inequalities have emerged. The third scenario, the Silicon Scaffold, is a Europe which consists in 2050 of digital relationships in a world shaped by transnational corporations. City-states and regions with corporate affiliations have come to the fore and developed their own authority. And the roots of this was richer regions growing dissatisfied with the EU mechanisms of redistributing resources and demanding more autonomy, which leads to an erosion of wealth redistribution and the state's role in providing public services being replaced by transnational corporations filling that gap. In wealthier regions, that means global tech companies signing deals to provide health, education, and transport services in return for access to data. In less developed regions, it means becoming dependent on mining, energy, agri-food companies that invest in service and infrastructure in terms of access to natural resources and agricultural resources. We also imagine here that there's more digital citizenship. So actually, you can actually buy citizenship of a different state if you want to access that digitally. So that actually, to some degree, separates social rights and spatial rights. Spatial justice here is therefore the right of regions to hold on to the wealth they've generated, but the territorial cohesion of the EU had been sacrificed for the growth of wealthier regions. And then finally, the patchwork rainbow is one in which European society has been ruptured by polarizing culture wars. The EU is now fragmented into semi-autonomous nations, regions, communities, founded on distinct cultural values. Independence in Scotland and Catalonia is a domino effect, with other regions becoming separate or radical decentralization in surviving nation states. And therefore, we get nations and regions becoming increasingly autonomous with different cultural values guiding them, from religious social conservatism through to progressive cosmopolitanism, through radical environmentalism, creating territorial inequalities. So there's substantial migration within Europe as people move to align with cultural values, but we also see a pattern of economic decline, increased care costs, reduced tax take from a contracting working age population, eroding the welfare state, and responsibility for welfare and public services, increasing rest in voluntary and community-based groups shaped by these dominant self-defined values of the regions and territories. So spatial justice here, the community's right to define their own values, but territorial cohesion at a European scale has become meaningless, albeit still perhaps some meaning within nations and regions. So these four scenarios are consciously polarized, extreme versions of the future. They're not intended to be a menu of options. And ultimately, the Europe of 2050 is likely to lie in somewhere between these. But they are intended to capture plausible trajectories of change that are rooted in developments we already see existing today. And they do all present further questions for EU cohesion policy. So the civil citadel, for example, is closest to conventional EU thinking. Imagining spatial justice as equitable distribution of resources being achieved at the price of centralisation. So this outcome may be more economically just, but for many EU citizens, the means of achieving it could be regarded as unjust. Green Guardian is an extension, of course, of Green Recovery or a Green New Deal or the Just Transition. It imagines a fundamental shift in societal priorities, the conflict of climate change and other crises. Territorial cohesion in the shape of a pan-European solidarity to help regions adjust to these crises, but it also involves new territorial politics with clear winners and losers. And then Silicon Scaffold and Patrick Rainbow both anticipate a rollback of political commitments to EU territorial cohesion in response to demands for territorial autonomy. So the Scaffold perhaps builds on some of the Brexit logic in the UK, taking back control of economic growth. But that combination can only be achieved in a few highly connected city regions, with more regions becoming highly marginalised and dependent on transnational corporations. And then finally, Patrick Rainbow is inspired in part by the kind of cultural tensions we see between the European Commission and socially conservative governments in Hungary and Poland at the moment. And this seems to offer little hope for European territorial cohesion, as it challenges the very notion of shared European identity, self-purpose. But we perhaps could see some states still, therefore, moves towards economic cohesion if they were just decoupled from cultural and political agendas. So the final slide, in terms of conclusions, what we've trying to show through this is that a multifaceted character of spatial justice highlights the trade-offs that are inherent in EU cohesion policy. It's not inevitable, therefore, that the principles currently embedded in cohesion policy will hold over the next 3 decades, but neither is there any single indisputed normative ideal of spatial justice that can guide territorial cohesion. And what we therefore say is that there needs to be a debate in Europe about what form of spatial justice should be prioritised and how EU policies can best work towards that goal. And the capacity of Europe to arrive at some kind of consensus around that will itself test or whether meaningful territorial cohesion can be achieved.
Thank you, Mike. I mean, this is evidently very relevant. We are also setting up a process in as the commissioner announced on the post-27 cohesion policy that starts with the next work group and with more work. And I mean, in this slide, these scenarios are very helpful. I think I would out myself as a Green Guardian actually, but I mean, I also have a history in biodiversity science. So any questions for Mike? I just yeah, okay.
Thank you, Mikko Wegrud from the National Resource Institute. Thanks for the great presentation, and nice to hear what has happened in Imagine since I left. I was actually working in the first work package, the conceptual one. And also, I think the scenarios are very useful in general for the science policy interface, and I'm so happy to see every time when I see it. I think that should be kind of even mandatory for each project to have it, because they give clear goals for the policy process. But I have a small question about the theme, which I'm personally interested in. In one of the, was it work package number 4, you made a survey on how individuals in regions think whether they are getting less or more EU funding, and then you showed a picture with the distribution in a map. Did you actually model the effect of each regional funding on the individual person, because whether it has an effect, because in technical terms it can be done. And it's because we all know that this geography of this content has a paradox, where the most money goes, they are the people who are most opposed to EU. So did you actually model this, and did you find anything interesting?
It's not been, we haven't modeled it exactly yet. I think we're still working on some of those results, and I think that bit of trying to model more precisely, to say the actual investment per person versus those perceptions would be an interesting thing to do statistically to do that. So I think that's something we can we can try to do. And I'll just add to that, 'cause I think that's, some of this is ongoing. So there is a more detailed written version of this talk. I'm not sure you can get through the app, but I'm happy to send that to anyone who's interested. And also on the Imagine website we had up there is more detailed versions of scenarios, the response to that, as well as a policy briefing with policy recommendations. I've got a couple of copies of those with me, but they're also on the website. And again, I'm happy to email those to anyone. But we're also finally in the process now of writing a vote from this, which will also give the opportunity to explore some of those questions further, which should be coming out open access with Edward Elgar next year. So I think lots of these things we're still trying to work in a bit more to join up the dots between some of these different parts of the project. And particularly the questions about links to geographies of discontent, which I think are valuable questions we need to explore a bit more.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Once again, thank you. Keep us informed also about the outcome. So I mean, we are very, very interested in that. Then we come to the final presentation of today. This is by Mikko Weckroth and by Michael Kull. They are scientists at the Natural Resource Institute in Finland, also called LUKE, right? The title sort of provides interesting clues about the musical preferences of one or both of the researchers, but I'm sure they can explain themselves. I'll just say it here: and justice, peace, and prosperity for all, seeking distributive, procedural, and recognitive spatial justice from the just transition mechanism in Finland. So I invite you both to the floor.
Thank you, dear moderator. As noted, we are sharing the presentations with my colleague Michael Kull. For some obvious reasons, we have quite many slides, and he's the fastest speaker in our institute. He can say 400 words in a minute, so it's really justified. I will open this up, and then Michael will give you the empirical story, and then I will wrap it up at the end. Very briefly, the structure, first starting obviously with the research questions, which we want to answer, then the strategy, how do we are going to do it. In one picture, the key components, kind of the literatures or debates we are merging into one article or analysis. In one slide, very brief literature, what has already been written about the JTF. It's relatively new, but there are some academic research already on it. Then the empirical parts, then the 3 key points, which is always good to have in the presentations. If you don't remember anything else, remember then, and then the usual conclusions part. What did we actually set out to do? We are interested to see how well does the JTF address distributive, procedural, and recognitive justice, especially in a Finnish context. I hope and I assume you are relatively familiar with these distributive different dimensions of justice, but if not, we will go there slightly more in detail in the next slide. Another research question is that we wanted to disclose the process of policy transfer from the Commission to the national, to the regional, the normal multi-level governance framework in the context of JTF. And especially we are targeting 2 regions in Finland, North and South Karelia. And this is also, I need to mention, it's work in a process. We have yet to do the interviews in the North Karelia and also in the European Union level. How review of the JTF documents, again, national level, regional level, and also the academic literature. And as I said, we are doing interviews and we are in the process of doing more interviews. So this is about halfway maybe on the empirical path. Results, academic article usually is the result, and maybe policy brief. Let's see where this takes us. I don't know if we can draft the scenarios here, but let's see. This is the big picture I promised, kind of the 3 debates we are dealing with. Obviously, we are studying the JTF, which we all know what it aims, kind of the similar agenda as the whole cohesion policy, with a quite ambitious and kind of noble agenda of leaving no person, no region behind. It's good agenda, even though it's of course not totally realistic. It gives us a direction. Then we have just transition literature, which usually distinguish between 3 dimensions of justice. Distributive is kind of refers only to mechanical allocation of resources between different partners. Procedural refers to the processes, whether all the stakeholders are involved in the process of the decision making. And recognitive is kind of the place-based, place-sensitive, kind of that the bottom-up approach, that the locally defined meaning of well-being process and local values are recognized. So in general, I think this is very useful frame for all the policymakers and scientists to evaluate any case of a just transition or cases of justness or injustice. Third part, the places that don't matter debate. It's obviously a partner here as well. And that also can be divided into different categories. That the uneven economic geography is kind of the very basic spatial nature of economy. It's not the world is not flat in economic terms. But then again, something I always try to emphasize is the subjective dimension, that it's geography of political agency is something which we have been studied. So it's about the subjective perceptions of justice, not the macroeconomic divergence between the regions, because it's all about the people and their emotions. And then again, locally defined well-being and development, reference to the Imagine project as well, is also a key component. And these are actually linked together quite nicely, kind of uneven economic distributive, the political agency, whether the people are actually part of the process, and the recognitive is the place-sensitive approach. This is the framework which we are operating in. Just briefly, this kind of, I have done with my previous colleague analysis, which kind of combines these environmental justice and the places left behind thesis in a single article. And the results are kind of quite alarming or concerning, because there really is urban, rural, and growing lagging regions division in the attitudes toward climate change. That's the beginning. I think actually we skip this, and I hand it over to Mihail.
Yes, thank you very much, and also thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, so let's. I would like to invite you on a journey into the multi-level governance of this JTF programming, Just Transition Fund programming. And before we go to this journey, we need to a little bit set the scene by seeing who are the key players in this on this journey. So if we start at the regional level, we have in Finland we have the regional councils. So they are 18 plus then the Åland Islands. They are joint municipal authorities in charge of regional development and regional planning. Then we have at the national level, we have the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment, who is in charge of regional development, the island policy, and also the integration of regional policy into rural policy. And then at the EU level, we have DG Regio. So, and we will hear a little bit how this interplay between these 3 levels has worked out. But before we go into this, let's have a quick look into the current situation with the national regional programs. So both the national JTF program and all the 14 regional programs have been approved by the Finnish government in October 22, and they were sent to the Commission for approval. The signal that came back was that they should be approved rather quickly. probably they are already now as we talk. And the plan is that the regions can start with the implementation in the spring of 23. Finland used to be among the leading countries back in the late 2020, early 21. But now we are in the middle and we dropped out a little bit here, and we will hear a story or some first indications why this was. So a lot of twists and turns of collecting data, opinions, and so on has been found on the way. So the focus in Finland and the JTF is peat, is the energy use of peat. And this was mainly motivated by the central government's commitment to reduce the energy use of peat by 50% until 2030. The expectations are that the decrease is even higher, and current estimations are by some regions that the production consumption could end almost completely already by 24. So while the JTF program is still on its way. Peat peaked in the early 2000s. It was about 7% of total energy consumption in Finland. And then it dropped down to about 5% in the 2010 years. And interestingly, we compare a little bit the other energy use forms in the other JTF benefiting countries, such as Estonia or neighboring countries. So they focus on oil shale, which is about 75% of Estonia's energy production, and approximately 60% of the final energy consumption. So it's quite different figures that we are talking about. But then again, if you look at the regional level, in the region that has the most use, it's the region of South Ostrobothnia, where the share was about 63%. In terms of job development, overall, it's also fairly marginal. So our case country, or that we have started to focus on, it's South Karelia. It's on the right side. We are now down to about 25 jobs approximately. The highest is in North Ostrobothnia. We are a bit over 220, and in Finland as a whole, the job is 1,066 at current level. So if we would break down the funding per head, and then it would be around €1 million for a person that would get retraining, if it would be just JTF. But we come to that discussion later on. So if we start our journey in two and a half years back, so as our interview from the national ministry said, so nobody really knew at the beginning what this JTF is all about. And also if you look into the literature that has been written about this, so this is kind of resonates with that as well. And we ask, of course, why was this focus on peat? So because it's the job level is minimal, and also the share as energy use was little. And it was clearly stated that this focus came from the Commission because of as I said earlier, the Finnish government's program's commitment to reduce energy peat. So it was a good entry point, so that there was a commitment, so we can follow up. And that was why the Commission wanted to link JTF to this commitment. There was already some, at that time, two and a half years back, some problems that were envisioned by our national ministry. So the peat focus is a very political question of importance. And they thought this will become difficult in the view of different stakeholders, but also the regional targeting later on. Then we have to focus on peat, the high focus on peat. That will be a real catastrophe. And will we see that the regions could use all the money later on? Quickly on this, the travel itinerary. So it was supposed to, it started quite well in the late 2020. Positive signs on draft regional plans already, and the idea was that probably we could already start with a call for applications for projects already in the autumn of 21, but it became quite different. And now, as I said earlier, the programs are with the Commission for a final approval, and we could probably start with the implementation in spring. No, it's wrong, in spring 23. So let's take a little walk into the multi-level governance of that. So starting first with the national and EU level relations, which can become maybe summarized as waiting for clear instructions. So this was probably the key message we received from our national ministry. So whilst in the preparations, so everybody was quite excited about that, but overall this was kind of withering away quite quickly, because they lacked clear instructions on how this could be actually treated. So we didn't progress. They were so unsure, so in the Commission, what they can tell us about that. And the hardest part that was felt on behalf of the national ministry was that the different positions from from the DGs Regio and Climate. So so one says it like that and the other differently. So kind of a lack of coordination here. So it was perceived as a very heavy process and also a lack of leadership on the way. And sorry to say that, but say that Regio, they said, was rather weak in this, and also DG Climate's role in that sense difficult, and one could hardly follow the actions regarding to the advice given on the way. But then, I mean, member states find ways, and there was a kind of a informal exchange or collaboration with other EU member states to exchange how they were probably pushed into certain themes, and then as a positive sign, the national desk, which was very helpful. And here the informality of policy making, very, very important. So trying to understand what's going on. Then multi-level governance type 2, so the national and regional level relationship, so which can be summarized as kind of handbrake turns on the way. This was again, or this was mainly from the regional stakeholders, but also the national level said, okay, you will probably hear the story when you talk to them. So the first message was that JTF is just transition money that is focused on regions phasing out peat, but you don't have to establish any direct links to peat whatsoever. But then after the first regional draft plans have been submitted, then they had to state strict links to peat and measures linked to peat. So kind of a abrupt turn. Then now in summer of 22, in addition to this peat links, there was also regional programs had to state how green transition is tackled and also how possibly the environmental energy impacts can be measured. And then finally, close to the submission, some technical things of cutting long text and the fear of losing probably some important issues that were covered. So the bottom line that was drawn that in general terms, it worked quite well, the collaboration, but the guidelines change fairly often. So where can we find the reason here? What is the problem probably? And then we thought a little back to Ian Bache's, Professor Ian Bache, famous gatekeeping term. So maybe there was some gatekeeping taking place at the national level. So kind of a filtering between the regions and the EU Commission, and that was kind of confirmed by the region. So they felt that maybe the stricter requirements from the Commission that came were caused by the national ministry. So that it was their fault to restrict regional programs because of own interest, to make it simpler, keep it easy, yes, and probably the Commission would have provided more space to use support activities wider, and the EU and the Commission having had a wider repertoire, for instance, in relation to indicators, individual measures for funding, but the national ministry wanted to have it simple, reduce priorities and support measures. The social aspect. So overall, one interim conclusion is that peat has been an entrance card to this JTF program development. And at the beginning, the guidelines were given from the ministry was that about 25% of each regional plan should have social fund measures there, but the regions wanted only about 10%. Our case study, the South Karelia, wanted to have about 15% because of the felt risk of social exclusion and the fairly low education levels of people in the peat sector, and especially in this rural peat community. So giving money for retraining education measures, and in addition to the JTF, there will be also the social climate fund coming. But important here is that the JTF does not support individual peat entrepreneurs or individuals directly. And yes, so how our ministry concluded this, so at the end of the day, the expectation is that it makes just the same as the other funds, ERDF and ESF. There was no need for this new funding instrument on their behalf. And in terms of program implementation, peat probably has no meaning anymore, not even the core for applications for the JTF funds have to relate to peat. So the three key points to take away. So the focus on people and social aspects is rather weak. So there's not direct links, as I said earlier. So there has no be direct links probably. We will see what the program implementation brings. But at the moment, as we could identify, there was no big link to that. The national ministry concluded that it didn't bring us anything, this new instrument, but a considerable amount of extra work and administrative confusion. So maybe some lessons to learn for the future programmatic periods. And the experienced person from the regional level who has been since the beginning, since Finland joined the EU in this program, regional programming, said is really a category of its own. All these changes, also sudden ones, took place several times. So this was kind of rather radical lesson learned. And Mikko, you will conclude.
Yes. I will wrap things up. Starting with the question which we started with. How well does the JTF address the dimension of justice? Well, not that well. Concerning the distributive, yes, money is still allocated on regional basis, but slightly with different mechanisms than the other regional fundings. So it does address just as well as normal or conventional regional money, but there's nothing specific on that. Concerning the procedural, it didn't go that well either, because the PEAT was already locked at the national level. Kind of the regional players didn't have much to say, even though they had to make the regional plans, of course. Recognitive, again, not that well. Yeah, this is kind of the obvious. The capacity of JTF to address the places that don't matter, and I'm speaking mostly from the subjective side, whether this kind of relieves the anti-EU and anti-establishment's attitudes toward the rural population in general. Well, no, because first of all, it's so marginal. There are 20 people employed in South Carolina. It doesn't really show up there either. Try to make a reference to the previous Imagine project, kind of reflections to the interviews we did there on the territorial cohesion and the commissioners, how they perceive the territorial cohesion. There we observed that there has been, at least in the narrative, how the territorial cohesion is presented, a shift from the GDP to well-being. But this has obviously not transferred to the JTF, unfortunately. As a final remarks, I'd like to kind of emphasize the importance of trying to really build the subjective feeling of justness in the transition, because in a democratic societies, that's the only option. If the people see the policy measures unfair, we have seen that they will start to vote parties which actually reject the whole need for the transaction. They don't seek for more just mechanisms. They kind of deny the whole importance of this. In that sense, in a democratic societies, the transition needs to be just, or it doesn't happen at all. Very final point. Unfortunately, there's kind of a lot of criticism, not from us, but kind of coming from our data. But then again, it would be nice to offer kind of suggestions or ways forward. And we are still in the process, so we have these data or impressions from the regions and national level, but we are yet to analyze kind of how did this went wrong and that could be improved. But something we have been talking is that, for example, Mihaly has been working a lot with the new leader programs that could have kind of applied or used to bring in the social dimension. And we close with the lyrics as observed via reference to the one song by Metallica. And let's hope that they are not singing about JTF. Most likely not, because that song was in the 80s and JTF is much newer invention. So let's try to avoid that. Thank you.
Actually, one of my favorite albums and my favorite speech. I wonder how much of the audience has the album of Halloween. Not so many. Anyway, questions. I don't see your hands. I just maybe I'll use the mic. I told you before I have a background as an ecologist, and I mean, for me, the including peat in the narrative of a just transition is a no-brainer actually, because peatlands, wetlands in general, I mean, they will have an essential role in climate change and how we will help us mitigate and adapt to climate change. Peatlands, they store water when there is too much, and they give us water when there is not enough. So, I mean, they are essential in the water cycle, and therefore also in how we adapt in the future to climate change and changing precipitation. But moreover, if managed well and if they are kept sufficiently wet, then peatlands absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere than forests. I mean, at rates of 2 times, 3 times the rate that forests actually sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. So I miss this point in the presentation. Maybe you consider it in your work, but I wonder in how far peat extractors can actually be trained to become managers of the peatlands and to provide a nature positive solution to climate change. Thank you.
I can start to try to answer. I think, as you said, your perspective is kind of ecological, and I'm not an expert on that. So in that sense, I'm not going to argue that peatlands are not important for the transition. Of course they are, but whether from a social scientist perspective, whether it is linked to the justness, that's kind of our negative or critical point. So in that sense, because in overall the volume in energy production and in jobs is so marginal in Finland, even those regions where it's more common. In that sense, it's a very challenging to connect it to the justice or the social aspect, even though, as you said, the peat issue needs to be included to the transition itself. But just transition, I don't know.
I would like to add, I think this is a very important point. And I think here again, we see this kind of a policy silo thinking, because I think there's a ongoing parallel discussion also ongoing in kind of a peat as wetlands and as ecosystem service providing to climate change adaptation mitigation. A lot of money is put into this also in Finland to see the potential of peat in this respect. But again, this seems to be somewhat disconnected from this whole discussion. But if you see, and we have to study also the results of the public consultation. I think many of the nature conservation organizations just put it as that. So not seeing as energy use, but see peat in a different light, not as it is constructed in the process of regional policy making and vis-a-vis the Commission and the national ministry. So I think that's the kind of that would be the key.
Yeah. Okay, but just to finish, I mean, it's a broader context. It applies to farmers as well, and how can farmers actually ensure that agricultural soils will take up more CO2? It requires a different management, but I think we can use or the experience of farmers, of peat extractors, and in such a way that they can keep on doing their job, but maybe with a slightly different twist. Mike.
Yes, thank you for that interesting talk. To what extent does peat cutting and peat use for energy in Finland have a cultural significance in rural regions, and how far is that part of thinking about a just transition? And one suggestion maybe might be interesting to look comparatively between how this has been approached in Finland and in Ireland, which is the other big country where peat has been a major source of energy. And Patrick Breshennen, for example, at Maynooth, I think has done work around environmental justice in that regard.
Maybe again I can start and Michal can complement. First of all, we only have focused on Finland at the moment, and I'm aware that Ireland is one of the countries, as you referred, where the peat is only a focus. But we haven't kind of done this comparative analysis yet. I have a slight understanding that people are more happy in the process in Ireland, but we need to work with that. But on the question how relevant, or is there kind of peat sector culture locally? We haven't digged deeper into that question as well, but I would guess that not that much. For example, comparing to assumption on Poland or countries like Poland, Eastern Europe, where the coal is so dominant, maybe in UK as well, that it kind of is source of one culture. But in Finland, the peat, as I said, in even those regions where it's more done, it's still quite marginal. They are not kind of a peat regions in that sense. So, and that again is maybe one of the source of the problems which we have. Okay.
Yeah, then just to add on that, yes, you know, the culture is probably more because you are the real Finn. I'm just the German that came in a little bit later, but also the aspect of seasonality, because the people that employed in the peat sector, they do this parts of the year, and then they go in during the winter they do different jobs. So that's also one important aspect. So these numbers that we see here that are employed, also that there's also the aspect of seasonality. So it's like people are usually, what we got is the education levels are rather low, and also there's not a high interest in this what we potentially what we got from the stories that of re-education also. So they will find their jobs. They are tractor drivers. They have their own tractor. They leave school and this, and then they will probably not be much interested in any re-education aspects either. So that's another issue here.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, this morning we heard from Mr. Bock that JTF is sort of the flagship type of instrument for future cohesion policy, but I mean, on the ground we hear a slightly different story, but let's learn from that. With this, Mikko and Michael, thank you once again for this presentation. We come to an end of this session. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for all the presenters again. So, and the session or the conference restarts at 1:45 after lunch. Thank you.
Yeah, so welcome everyone to this session on institutions and governance. My name is Riccardo Crescenzi from the London School of Economics, and I will be the chair of this session. We have 4 presenters, 2 online and 2 in person. Given that we have 4 presenters, we will have approximately 20 minutes for each presenter. And I will try to have like 15 minutes of presentation and 5 minutes for Q&A. Following the presentation, I will show the slides for those of you who are present, and maybe I will try to send something in the chat, but maybe it's easier for people online to check their time. Without any further ado, I will leave the floor to Arnaud for his 15-minute presentation. We present a paper on policy entrepreneurs, strategies, and institutional context in Interreg Europe. Arnaud, the floor is yours for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Riccardo. It's great to be here online. Although it's online, I would have loved to be here with you in Zagreb. And thanks so much for the Regional Studies Association for this invitation. I cannot see who is in the room, but I guess many great people are here. So it's great to be here. So I'm going to present today a very interesting paper on policy entrepreneurs, the strategies that they use to introduce policy changes and in different institutional contexts, and looking at this case of Interreg Europe. So I wrote this paper with Evangelia Petridou and Arnaud Morrison. I'm a postdoc at the University of Bern. So first, in economic geography, there is this new literature on Trinity of Change agencies, those different type of agents trying to transform, to introduce new things. And in economic geography, there's not much literature on policy entrepreneurs. So briefly, who are the policy entrepreneurs? The policy entrepreneurs are agents in the public sectors who aim to introduce new policy changes. They can be inside or around the government, such as intermediary organizations, for instance. And when they try to introduce a policy change, they can use very different type of strategies. And however, there's been a lot of literature looking at strategies and policy entrepreneurs and so on, but there's very little literature on strategies and specific contextual factors and in different institutional contexts. So here you're going to see it's great because we're using a mixed method design, and we're using survey and also interviews. So in the strategies, what we are using in this surveys, in this article, we're using the strategy defined by Brouwer and Hultema. And they found there are 4 different types of categories. You can have the attention and support seeking strategies. And in these strategies, you can have evidence-based approach, using storytelling, using specific events to support the policy change that you want to make. You can have linking strategies. So here is bringing stakeholders together, building coalitions, making compromise with other stakeholders. You can have relational management strategies. Here is about networking with the different stakeholders, building trust. And you can also use this category of arena strategies. And here it's really about selecting the specific stakeholders in your region. It can be used, waiting for a window of opportunity, waiting for the right timing to push for specific policy changes. And we're using Interreg Europe as a case. So Interreg Europe is a very interesting European program. It's part of the European Territorial Cooperation of EU cohesion policies. It's financed by ERDF. They had a budget of 359 million for the 2014-2020 programming period. And what Interreg is all about is really a capacity building program. It's really about promoting better policies for regional policymakers to deliver better regional innovation policies. And they work on 4 different dimensions in priorities, objectives, thematic objectives in 2014-2020. One of those was research and innovation. You had SME competitiveness, low carbon economy, and resource efficiency. And we decided to focus on the projects that were aiming to deliver policy changes in research and innovation. So how does it work in Interreg Europe? So you have in research and innovation 65 different Interreg Europe projects in research and innovation. And they work on very different topics. So it can be for drones, for smart specialization, for centers of competence, for university industry collaboration, and so on. And in those projects, you have partners, usually between 5, 6, working for a period of time, 3 to 5 years. They share good practices, they share experience, they travel to each other regions. And the aim of the program is for those partners to start learning from other regions, and with the objective to introduce policy change in order to have better policies. So what is very important also to highlight is those regions the partners participating in Interreg Europe in those projects. They are not obliged to have a policy change, but of course that's much better when they have such policy change. So the research question of this paper, there are mainly 2. The first one was what are the main strategies that policy entrepreneurs use to introduce policy changes in the context of research and innovation policies tied to EU funding, using Interreg Europe projects, the 65 Interreg Europe projects in research and innovation. And we wanted to understand how do these strategies vary across different regional institutional contexts. So what was the methods that we use? Here is a mixed method. So what is very interesting is we use a survey that we sent to all the partners in research and innovation in Interreg Europe. So it was sent to over 500 different persons. And what is very interesting to note is that you have in research and innovation 168 regions participating and 65 different projects. We were lucky because we gathered 73 answers, and of which we only had 63 that were valuable for this research. And it worked as a sequential explanatory design because we had this survey and then we found some very interesting results. And we wanted to better understand those results. So that's why we conducted 12 follow-up interviews with the specific partners. And in order to find the significant findings, we used the t-test method. And the way we divided the institutional context, we look at the European Regional Innovation Scoreboard. So we divided regions into low innovator and high innovator. Low innovator being the emerging and moderate innovators, and the high innovators being the strong and innovation leaders. And also we categorize according to geographical dimensions. So we looked at Eastern European regions, we look at Southern European regions and Northern European regions to try to find some difference in the strategies that the policy entrepreneurs used. So let's go to findings. That's the first overview of the significant findings we found. So we found some quite interesting findings. The first one is when we look at the work experience, so looking at policy entrepreneurs with a lot of work experience, like more than 10 years, and the one with less work experience, we found that the policy entrepreneurs with less work experience used more evidence-based approaches. which I found very interesting because this is what you know, the European Commission has been pushing in the last programming period with smart specialization, using evidence-based approach, and we see that the younger policy entrepreneurs they use much more this strategy when they want to introduce a policy change. Something also interesting, but which was expected. So when the policy change has funding compared to when they don't have funding, we found that policy entrepreneurs, they use a variety of diverse range of multiple strategies. So they use more evidence-based approach, building advocacy coalition, networking with stakeholders, building trust, and selecting stakeholders. So using much more strategy when they are funding. By difficulty, so meaning the easiness to introduce a policy change, we found out, and that's super interesting, we found out that the policy entrepreneurs who use storytelling more and arena strategy less. So the arena strategy being selecting the stakeholders and waiting for the right timing, they found it less difficult to introduce a policy change. So storytelling, less difficult to introduce a policy change. And when you use arena strategy, is more difficult for you to introduce a policy change. Let's move on to significant strategies in different institutional contexts. And that's one of, I think, the most interesting finding that we have. So we found out that the use of storytelling is more important in high innovators than in low innovators, meaning that high innovators are using more storytelling. And we found out that this use of storytelling is positively correlated with the ease of introducing a policy change. And we found out as well that storytelling is much more widely used in Northern European than in Southern European regions. Again, something that is a little bit expected, but here it was very interesting to have that. And something else that was a significant finding when we look at different institutional contexts, we found out that selecting stakeholders who are more prone or more interested in the policy change is more important in low innovators than in high innovators, and is more widely used in Eastern European regions compared to Northern European regions. So here we can explain this. Eastern European countries are usually more hierarchical, coming from this post-socialist institutional framework. So we can think that, okay, they're selecting those, they really take some time to select the right stakeholders. And that was very interesting. But this is where we went to do the follow-up interviews, because we want to understand all the policy entrepreneurs use storytelling. I mean, to whom, why, and what were the tactics that were used as well. So we have some interesting results regarding the use of storytelling as well, and what are the tactics that policy entrepreneurs use. So the main contribution of this paper, to be very quick, to summarize, this is one of the few quantitative studies looking at strategies and connecting policy entrepreneurs to policy changes. Also, it highlights some of the skills needed to successfully introduce policy changes, a policy change for institutional entrepreneurs, what kind of strategies they use. And we think from the findings of this importance of storytelling for policy change, and from the interview, the interviewees highlight this is especially important for more soft policies. And what we found out is the policy entrepreneurs, they use very different tactics depending on the audience. So they're gonna tell different stories to different groups. For instance, when they tell the story to decision makers, they try to connect, to align with policy directionalities at the EU level, green, digital twin transitions, and so on. So trying to translate policy directionalities into the regional context. when they tell stories to stakeholders, they're going to put the stakeholders as kind of the heroes of the policy change. And when they tell to citizens, they are trying to engage and mobilize citizens. And what also is very interesting is they use this strategy of storytelling mostly to mobilize and advocate. So mobilize the different stakeholders and citizens and advocates decision makers. So this is for me. Thanks so much. This is a working paper, so please have questions for me. That would be great. And thanks for being here. You can contact me at any time if you have questions on this working paper. And thanks so much.
For your presentation. So we have questions from the audience. Please, if you can introduce yourself so that from home they can see.
Yes, Justine Paladinska from the European Commission, previously academic in social collective action. So I'm interested on two grounds in your presentation. One question that I would have is, you have mentioned that less experienced policy entrepreneurs have more recourse to evidence-based policy, but then more innovating entrepreneurs use more storytelling. Is there a correlation between those two strategies, or is there an opposition, I mean, between the two? You could also imagine that the more they're experienced, the more they can use storytelling and use evidence-based to promote their strategy. So I was wondering if there's an opposition between the two. And the second thing is we are working in DG Regio to support administrative capacity building. And I'm very interested in the presentation because I think this would be a very good tool for us to reach the policy entrepreneurs, to support them, to find the innovators in policy making. And I'm thinking, okay, this could be interesting to find them, find where to identify them, how to reach them, and how to help them, find ways to support them in their endeavors. So, well, two questions, one theoretical, one practical. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your question. So the first one, is regarding this policy entrepreneurs who have less work experience. So work experience below 10 years, they use evidence-based strategy much more. But it doesn't mean here that the policy entrepreneurs with more work experience use more storytelling. The use of storytelling is more used in high innovators, so high innovator regions, but it's totally different from whether the policymakers have more or less experience. So storytelling is used in those high innovators and Northern European countries more, regions more than in Southern European countries and low innovators. So that's one of the significant findings. But I can send you the draft article so you can get a better understanding of what the significant findings are. And regarding policy recommendations, what you mentioned is, I think, supporting policymakers to really grasp the importance of storytelling, especially in Southern Europe and low innovators, could be really, really helpful. And for instance, in the interviews, what the policy entrepreneurs usually mention is the use of having short videos, very well done by professionals to communicate to the stakeholders and communicate to citizens was really helpful. And they mention as well that it's a specific skills to tell a good story, right? It's not everyone who has this ability to convey and be a very good communicator. And I think this is where like some capacity building could be done for policy entrepreneurs to better have like this sense of how to communicate and tell good stories to decision makers, stakeholders, and also civil society and citizen. I hope this is a little bit clear.
you very much. I'm nodding, you don't see us, but let's get in touch.
Thanks. Yeah, sure.
Any other question? Well, I will use my authority as a chair to ask the question. Do you link politician with actual outcomes? In the sense, like, we know that innovation is good because it produces new products or new services, and then the market decides if the innovation is good or not. When it comes to policies, to public policy, like a policy entrepreneur might be also putting forward the idea of interest groups. So I want a new policy because I can profit from it. So from your interviews, how to what extent these policy entrepreneurship is associated with positive outcomes, with better policy, vis-a-vis rent seeking or new interest groups emerging and trying to benefit from the policy?
Yeah, very good question again. So here from the interviews, because of course was not in the surveys, we couldn't really, grasp why policy entrepreneurs really want to make a change. But from interviews, I mean, they love their regions. They really want to make a transformation. I mean, this is what we had, when we ask what motivates you to make a policy change, was always the same story, saying, I really want to make a change and make a transformation. So, very much into this Mazzucato way of working with the willing, right? So that was interesting.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. I think we need to move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
So without any further ado, I will give the floor to Mara Juan from the University of Roma Tre, who will present a paper titled The Gospel on Euro Institutional Quality and the New Value-Added E-Commission Policy. Mara, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Riccardo, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for the opportunity of being with you, even from home, unfortunately. And well, I hope that you can hear me quite well. Otherwise, please let me know. The paper that I'm going to present you today is a joint work with Viviana Celli from Sapienza University, with Riccardo Crescenzi, who is London School of Economics, who is chairing us this evening, and with Guido De Blasio from the Bank of Italy. And this work came back on the concept of the European value added in doing development policies. And why? Well, in a moment where doing development policies, funding development measures is something that will be done under the European umbrella, of course, in particular because of the launch of the Next Generation EU program, right? So we know that in the next following years we will be spending a lot of money under this European umbrella to promote development projects, and we also know that this is something that has been how can I say described in a controversial way up to now. On one side, we have highlighted that there might be a certain value added of doing this kind of stuff under the European rules, regulation, and stable frameworks. On the other side, this involvement of the European Union in such as policies has been largely a question, if you want, because it has been claimed from different perspectives that there are a certain degree of administrative rigidities and stringent requirements for beneficiaries that might turn into slowly implemented policies and projects that are not coherent with the aim that we have in Next Generation EU today, right? They're one of doing things well, but also very fast. So we came back on this debate with this paper, asking ourselves if there is a way to measure this EU value added in doing development policies, if this is an asset or a liability for the EU member states, the fact of having this European umbrella under which funding development projects. And also, if this is true for everybody, for any kind of territories, regions, or if there is a certain specificity for those regions, those territories that might present weaker institutional quality, for example, and this might be particularly relevant if we think about the different candidates countries that are queuing to join the European Union nowadays. So, why we are presenting this paper at this conference? Well, we use the case of cohesion policy as a unique laboratory to study this relation, the relation between the role of the European value added in doing development policies. In fact, during the latest programming period in different countries, and Italy is one of them, projects and with similar objectives have been funded both under the European umbrella and under a fully national cohesion policy framework. So we have the possibility to look at what happened at those projects that with similar aim were funded in Italy during the latest programming periods in the European and in the national schemes of the cohesion policy. And in particular, what we do is to focus on those infrastructural projects, and we wanted to evaluate the causal effect of belonging to a European or to a national scheme of cohesion policy. In terms of what? In terms of the project's implementation on the ground. And we measure these projects' implementation on the ground looking at the progresses in terms of payments, in terms of the share of payments over the total cost of the projects over time. So we basically wanted to see if European or national projects present different behaviors in terms of being implemented according to their original timeline or not. In order to do that, we rely on a project level analysis, and this is why we focus on the case of Italy, if you want, thanks to the availability of the Open Coesione dataset. And in order to identify the causal effect, so to isolate the role of belonging to a European or to a national program in terms of projects implementation, we exploit a certain event that characterized the Italian 2007-2013 programming period, which has been the launch of an action plan for cohesion, according to which some European programs have been reshuffled, and in this context, we had a reduction of the national co-financing to the European programs, okay, and the resources that have been saved in this way have been directly implemented to finance new national program that have been called Action Plan for Cohesion programs. These programs will use the resources that have been saved from the reduction of the co-financing in the European program, and will host some of the projects that were born in the European program and that in that occasion moved to this newborn national program. So basically what happened is that we have a set of projects, a set of more than 8,000 infrastructural projects, among which roughly 200 move from the European program to the national one. And we have been able, thanks to these project level data and thanks to data on payments that were collected monthly from 2007 to 2017, we have been able to reconstruct a counterfactual group of projects for those projects that we identified as treated, that are the one that originated in the European program and then moved to the national one. How do we construct this counterfactual group of projects? Well, we rely on a counterfactual methodology that is basically based on the matching in terms of the full time temporal variability of the outcome variable. So basically we rely on the data in terms of financial progress at the monthly level, at the each month. And we observe this data even both in the pre-treatment period and in the post-treatment period. And we use similar trends of this outcome variable in the pre-treatment period to match and to find similar projects, among which some of them have been treated, so moved to the national program, and some other have been not treated, so remained in the European program where they born. More particularly, we select for each treated project a set of control projects with similar trends in the pre-treatment outcome and control covariates. Then we refine this matched set by using Mahalanobis distance in order to identify the closest 5 neighbors to this treated project, also based on time invariance project characteristics. We have more than 200 variables that we can use to identify time invariant project characteristics in this matching procedure. Then, of course, we estimate for each treated project the counterfactual outcome using the average of the 5 units that we identified. And finally, we compute the difference in differences of the average treatment effect. And what we found is that after the treatment, so when they move to the national program, those projects experience a slowing down in terms of financial progress. So basically, their counterparts that remain in the EU program keep going better than how these treated projects start doing in the national program. And when we separate in 2 groups our projects by isolating the group of projects belonging to national program and the group of projects belonging to regional programs, we found that this negative effect of the non-Europe is attributable to those projects that were originated in regional programs. And this open a sort of this open to a scenario where this European value added is particularly relevant in those contexts where there is a certain variability, heterogeneity in terms of management of these programs that we can observe more for those regional programs than for the national one. So something that might change a lot across regional authorities is, of course, the institutional quality of the context where they are operating. And we are going to focus on these exactly. So the role of the value added of the European Union for doing development policies seems to be important, but it seems to be particularly important where there is, in a context where institutional quality is not stable, it's very heterogeneous across units. And this is what exactly happened in most of our regions, and especially in those countries that are going to join us in the next few years, probably. And a way to study this role of institutional quality as mediator of this effect of the EU value added on the implementation of the development policies is to apply mediation analysis technique. We are working on these, so these are very preliminary results, but it seems to suggest that there is a significant, although marginal, part of the total effect that we have estimated to the EU value added that is explained by the local institutional quality. And what we use here to measure local institutional quality is a provincial version of the institutional quality index that we all know. So to conclude, infrastructural projects that move in Italy to the national programs experience slower financial progresses than their counterparts remain in the EU program. And this might be particularly true for those areas where weaker local institutions are working and dealing with these projects. We do think that this is an important result both for the European cohesion policy, but also, and more importantly, for the next generation EU implementation that is now going to be the protagonist of the next few years of development projects in Europe. I might have finished my time and also my slide. So thank you for the attention, and be happy, more than happy to take questions.
Any questions? Please, you can introduce yourself for the benefit of the speaker.
Yeah. My name is Francesco Modelo. I work at UC Reggio on administrative capacity. I think my colleague in the geographical unit will be very happy about this presentation, because what you are saying is something a bit I interpret it a different way. When a project is introduced in the operational program, means that is complying with the principle, the selection criteria, and so on. The moment this project moves out of the program, it doesn't change its name. So it remains the same project. So it has the same value as before, nothing has changed. What has changed is the way the project is monitored and followed. If you notice, and this is just a financial implementation, you are not talking about whether the outcome is different from before. So I suppose the outcome and of the project remain the same. So what does it change is the way the project is followed, the fact that N+2 and N+3 rule is pushing for the implementation. The managing authorities which are working are providing support to the program. All the system which is behind an EU project is providing another value. And that's what I think you really catch, that there is a follow-up. There are people working in Brussels, in the region, in the coordination, which are helping the project to stay on the timetable. That is what you are basically showing. So thank you very much.
Please. I think we can collect the questions, then Mara can respond. Mara, can you hear the question?
I'm trying to get as much as I can, but yes.
So I hope I'm not too loud for you. I'm Louis Dexter. I also work for the DG for Regional Policy. Wave your hand, Mara, if you can hear me better.
Thank you. Yeah, don't worry. Try.
Question. Do the transport projects differ between the national and the regional level? I mean, are they smaller? Are they focused on a different type of transport? Was curious to learn more if the projects themselves have characteristics which you control for or not.
Another question in the back.
Francesco Rota, University of Bari. Ciao Mara.
Ciao.
Help me to remember, I mean, the park was defined according to the EU rules. I remember well, in the sense that I can say the governance was the same, if I remember well. So this, I'm not sure that you are catching the value added of European rules in that sense. And another small things, when the project moved from EU package and national package, which is the reason? Where project with problems, because if this is true, again, it's difficult to infer that we have EU value added in this respect. And a curiosity, you said that the last slide that you are going to use institutional quality at provincial level. Why not regional level? Just a curiosity. Thanks.
Thank you, Mara.
Thank you all for this very interesting point. Let me start from the first one. Well, yes, I am. If I am correctly getting your point, you are highlighting that the project once became national doesn't change its objective, but rather the way in which it is monitored and evaluated. I would add also the way in which it is implemented in terms of management of the different steps that the project have to carry out to get effective and accomplish on the ground. And this is the reason why we have decided to focus on infrastructural projects that by nature have this timeline in which we can observe the time trend, the temporal progress of the payments and how they change in a certain period where the European Union regulation is dealing and monitoring on these towards and against a period where this monitoring is missing. Let me move to the Louis point. So this is my fault for the sake of saving time. I didn't show you the one that are called in this technical language the balancing properties that we computed using these 200 variables that we have at the project level thanks to Open Coesione. And according to this variable, we can make sure that the differences from national and European projects in terms of the things that you were mentioning, Luis. So the size, the kind of infrastructure that they fund, and so on and so forth, are not significant. Even if some significant difference exists in origin, we are able to offset it with the counterfactual technique that we apply, and the counterfactual group that we finally use does not present any significant difference with respect to the treated one. But this is a crucial point, of course. If they would have been different, we couldn't be able to compare them in terms of outcome. Then, Francesco, your points on the governance of the PAC. If I'm not wrong, but we will be checking together, if you want, the long document on the action plan for cohesion. The idea of applying the action plan was exactly the one of offsetting the N+2, N+3 rules, for example. So these resources that we are saving from the co-financing of the European program are moved to this national program exactly because in that case they wouldn't be not subject to these Tagliola financial rules, according to which money would be spent in a certain deadline. So the governance should be different enough, and which is the reason why some projects are moved to national programs. Well, of course, again, this is the crucial point, the selection into treatment, to use the counterfactual language, and we managed to control for these with our balancing properties and with the pre-treatment trend in terms of outcome that I was mentioning before, but we can talk about these more deeply if you like. I would be more happy to do it with more time. And the provincial institutional quality of index, well, to guarantee much more variability than the one that we could have if we look at the regional one, since we are dealing with the Italian case and we have a limited number of regions, as you know. I took a lot of time, sorry.
Thank you very much. The time is up. Thanks for your. I will leave immediately the floor to Elena Renzullo, who will present the paper entitled "New Money and Mayors: Tax Cohesion Policy Affect Local Electoral Outcomes." Elena Renzullo, thank you.
Okay. Hello to everybody. I'm very happy to be here presenting this paper that is part of my PhD thesis that is co-authored with Martin Cavato. So I'm sure that you all well know which is the role of cohesion policy. I cannot move on. Okay, sorry. Okay. So I know that you well know which is the role of cohesion policy, so I will just skip it. And in some way, what we would like to do in this work is to verify whether cohesion policy could also influence the voting behavior of the individual. And there are many reasons why this could be the case. For example, there is a very huge recent literature analyzing the fact that European funds can influence the voting behavior of individuals, such as, for example, reducing the support for Eurosceptic parties. What we would like, so this is the correct last slide. So what we would really like to do in our work is to put again the focus on something that we really discussed well today, so the place-based structure of the policy. Because in all of this work, they may be focused on national electoral outcome. What we would like to do is focus on local electoral one, because we believe that it's crucial to in some way have the activism of the local community and a good place-based structure of the policy. Our case study is Italy. I know that you will know that in some way the European region policy has a double nature. They follow a formal-driven design, so that developed region obtains the largest amount of money. When we look at Italy, it's the southern part of Italy, and we want to focus again on the place-based approach. So this means that it's partially sensitive and we follow in some way a bottom-up approach, because it's people proposing their project that then can be financed by the European Commission. So of course, we would like to raise the focus on place-based policy and contribute to the literature on European Commission policy and political outcomes. To fulfill this goal, our research question is whether the European cohesion policy increased the likelihood of Italian mayors to be confirmed in power. We decided to focus our attention on Italian mayor because this is the smaller level of government in Italy, and because they have a leading role and they are directly elected by the individual. Okay. So this is coherent with two retrospective voting literature that one on reciprocity and for the effect of the policy. This is mainly a literature on targeted policy, such as conditional payment transfer. And coherently with this literature, our hypothesis is that targeted region will reciprocate the economic advantage obtained by the European cohesion funds, electorally remunerate the incumbent mayor that we strongly believe have a crucial role in attracting the European funds. The second trend of the literature we are relating to is the one of economic voting that simply claim that when economic conditions are better, the chances of the incumbent politician to stay in place are larger. So given the goal of cohesion policy, we believe that when given the fact that European cohesion policy improves its living conditions, then the incumbent mayor has more chances to stay in power. Okay. So to fulfill the goal of our analysis, we construct a very huge database relying on Open Coesione. Today we have many papers using the data of Open Coesione because they are really detailed ones. So we have information on two different cycles of cohesion policies, so from 2007 to 2020, and we have again information at the project level, so very detailed. And we merge this information at the municipal level in Italy with detailed information on mayor, such as, for example, personal characteristics, education and previous jobs, and municipal election results. This information comes from the Italian Ministry of the Interior, and we complete our database with a series of socioeconomic and demographic control. What I have to specify is that we restrict our sample to mayor running for re-election. So we are comparing only mayor running for re-election, and in some way this restricts the number of information at the legislature level that we can rely on. And you can see on the right-hand side the amount of our sample. We don't have just information on 4 of the autonomous regions in Italy. Okay, so given this richness of this huge database, we try to exploit the information as much as possible. Just to give you a flavor of the goodness of the database, we have information about the starting date and ending date of each project, and then we really have information on when the money are flowing in, so of each different payment for the European cohesion policy. So we try to exploit this information, and we create 3 different measures of European cohesion funds. The first one is fund current. So in that case, we consider all the amount of payment arrived in each specific legislature only for those projects that started in that legislature. The contrary is fund completed. So we consider payment for projects completed in each legislature. What we would like to do with these two different measures is to capture two moments of high visibility, because we know that this is important, of the policies that are the starting and the ending one. And also to capture the ability of the mayor to activate and complete European projects. And finally, we have the definition, the third measure that is found for in the fact that consider payment for all the projects in each register. So every type of payment. I'm sure that my explanation was not clear enough, so have a graph of it. So in this case, we have three different legislators with the associated to the mayor running for the election, and a very simple case. We have just three projects. Project 1 starting legislature 1 and then legislature 2. Project 2 that is across legislature 2 and legislature 3. And then we have project 3 in legislature 2. So we look at just a legislature 1. What will be considered? In the case of fund current, we have just one project starting in this legislature. So we will consider the amount of payment for the project 1 arrived between 2010 and 2012. In the case of funds completed, it will be equal to 0 because no project comes to an end in this legislature. And in this case, funds current part will consider all the amount of money in that period of time. That is the simple example corresponds to funds current. Okay. Okay, this is our specification. So we have as a dependent variable a dummy one equal to 1 in case of the election of the mayor. Our main explanatory variable is the categories of European funds that I mentioned before. And then we have a huge bunches of control. We have a vector of control of mayor features such as proxy of abilities, such as, for example, education and legal jobs, and also proxy of charisma, such as the vote margin, the margin of victory. Legislature features, social economic and demographic control, and we also add a series of fixed effects. Okay. So finally, we arrived to our first result, and this is on all our sample, and you can see that there is a relation between European funds and the chances of the mayor to be confirmed in power, but this is mainly driven by the ability of mayor to activate the new European project. What we would like to do in the second part of our analysis is we also question whether the amount of your funds received matter for the electoral performance of the mayor. We try different specifications to verify whether it is the case. And I will show just for a matter of time the first one. And here you can see that it is clearly the case. So when we look at the less developed regions, so those obtaining the largest amount of funding and where the policy is also more visible, there is the relation between European cohesion policy and local electoral outcome is highly there. And it is for all our three different categories of funding. In the last part of our work, we also decide to consider some other mediator factor that will be crucial in explaining this relationship, such as the fact that the goal of the cohesion policy is really widespread in some way. So we have very huge number of thematic objectives. And so we would like to verify whether all spending is not equal. So we will merge them in three main categories, and we will see which is the difference in terms of electoral return for the mayor. Then we will consider also citizen living condition, because there are papers showing that the effect of European cohesion policy on political outcome is mainly driven by citizen living conditions, for example, in reducing the support for country parties. And then we will consider also political accountability, because again, visibility of the project is crucial. And to measure political accountability, we will perform our analysis on small municipalities. Okay, so going to the first mediator factor. Okay, this is our result. So we merged the systematic objective of the cohesion policy in those targeting services, businesses, infrastructure, and you can see that service is the one that matters the most, and this is particularly true in inner areas in Italy, that is coherent. And when we look at the citizen living conditions, so we see that municipality featured by a large economic growth, again, there we have a very clear relation between European cohesion policy and local electoral outcome. Finally, also the political accountability seems to be important. In fact, in smaller municipality, the ability of the mayor to activate new European projects supported them in the next electoral round. And it is mainly driven by municipalities with less than 5,000 now. So going to the conclusion, what we would like to stress in our work is the relation, of course, between European cohesion policy and local electoral outcome that is a crucial driver for state-based policy. But this relation in some way is eminently dependent by the design of the policy itself and its effectiveness. The relation is there, but of course, it depends also by the visibility and the dimension of the project that we will consider, and it is mediated by several factors such as thematic objective, citizen living condition, and political accountability. So say that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
First, you have a lot of controls, but do you control also if the measure is of the same political party of the governor of the region and is in line also with the national government? I mean, this is in political economic research, it's quite common, just curious to control for that.
Thank you for the question. This is something that we have think to do several times, but at the end I believe that we never implemented, but it's something that for sure we can try to do. The only problem is that when we look at the ideology at the municipal level, of the local government, most of the mayor comes from a civic group. So it's not really easy to identify them. It should be do by web scraping and some work, so it would be very good work, but we are thinking to do that maybe in the future.
It is a channel, not because they are the same party. We will see ahead from
yeah. But from the data that we have, like parties that are also Korean with the regional and national level are very key in our sample, so it's really difficult in some way.
Please. Here we are talking about the perception, because I guess the citizens, they don't know who is the beneficiary of the project, no? Because if you are talking about a scheme for SMEs, maybe this is a regional or national scheme. So the citizen in the city is the recipient, but it doesn't know whether the mayor has or doesn't have an active role. And this is the second point. And then there are many studies which they talk about how many citizens are aware of cohesion policy. And so the Eurobarometer provides some information. Will you use this information in your knowledge to know that how much is accepted of the EU funds by the citizens?
Okay. About the awareness on cohesion policy, this is of course a crucial point in our work. Unfortunately, we cannot rely on the information of the Eurobarometer because they are not at the municipal level. So of course we can put a higher level of control. But in some way, this was what we had in mind when we speak about the visibility of the policy, and when we try to explore as much as possible the timeline of each project, such as the ending and the starting project, because in that case, we believe that the visibility of each project is, of course, larger, even, of course, in the case in which we look at the less developed regions, so when the inflow of funding is larger. And Yes. I believe that
You show that services,
yes.
the kind and the intervention that is more effective and the kind of false intervention that people, I mean, see and they experiment on themselves.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of
Because,
reassuring, even
yeah.
also because it's coming from
Yeah.
general areas, so it's also coherent with the definition. Thank you.
And last but not least, we have our final presenter, Mariana Suntor, Policy. And we present a paper entitled European Integrated Territorial Development and the Case of Liberation Island. The floor is yours. For 2 minutes.
Yes, we want to present together and give practice. So it's just a quick greeting from the city of Zagreb and I'm a member of the city assembly of the Economic Council, and I'm very glad that you're hosting this conference in Zagreb. So thank you for being here. Then I will start. He is my mentor and we still work together until we go. So.
Thank you. Is this good slow? Okay, we'll see. Well, it is about a policy sub-issue. The islands have always been a policy sub-issue until 2016. EU policymakers even considered that islands differ so much, and all the archipelagos around the European seas are so different, heterogeneous, that every country that has islands should take care of themselves and have a tailor-made policy. In 2016, a resolution on the special situation of islands was passed by the EU Parliament, and this could be viewed as a beginning of the EU island policy. But regardless of that, there are still local specificities, island specificities that wait for full recognition. And it calls for all the archipelagos from the Baltic Bay down to the Aegean Sea, including Adriatic and in particular Croatian islands. And this is what we have to, because I don't know if they ever appear on the screen. Okay. It's metaphorical. Once and okay. It's not a big archipelago. In Croatian terms, it's big, but just 6% of the Croatian mainland, but it's brings a lot of people to the sea. So if you count Croatia as a sum of equatorial and territory, then they bring 37% of Croatia, and only 50 are inhabited. There and 40 out of these 50 are small. There is a constant discussion on how small island has to be considered small, but it's different on different seas and archipelagos. In Adriatic, it means that islands that are less than 25 kilometers, and less than 250 souls live there, and most of the Croatian islands have even less than that, 100, 150, even less than 100. And this is quite a question here because they have been inhabited since, Paleolithic, and the population has been growing steadily across throughout centuries, but it reached historical maximum in 21, and then a couple of crises. It hit entire Europe, not only the islands. They simply pushed the islanders into immigration, and it's been going down till 1981, and then again increase was recorded, and at the point that we all thought that everything is all right and that we have a steady state development. Last census last year showed that this decreased again. And it kind of brings the question, is such a region, such a micro region, is it worth an expected development policy? Well, there are still enough people, even in the Croatian state administration, The thing is that we are not working special policy, because if we have island policy, which is the coastal policy, which is the hinterland policy, which is the mountain policy, which is the policy of the plains, which is the policy of North Croatia, which is different than the rest of the country, and everything is different enough here. So the question remains unanswered properly so far, but it's been solved constitutionally. Okay, Constitution of the Republic of Croatia states that islands that are determined by law and not to be of interest of the Republic of Croatia, they shall have its special protection. It's a very solid foundation for the beginning of the island policy. But policymakers took around 10 years to operationalize this, but nevertheless, we are celebrating now 25 years of island development policy, started in 1997 with a program, which didn't bring much change, but the Island Act did, and it was amended so many times, and then it was there was so many amendments that the new one had to be drafted and passed and so on. Then we have a new national island development action plan, and we have another amendment, and we are looking forward to another amendments again. And it's quite a question here, who implements this, who is in charge of the island development here. And we first have to look at the government levels. There are 3 layers of government in Croatia. On a national level, Ministry of Regional Development, the European funds, and its island development department. They should take care about island development at the national level, but there are also 6 coastal island counties, and there are also sub-regional level, 8 coastal and island municipalities, and then it gets very complicated because some islands have more than 1 municipality. Some islands belong to coastal municipalities, and there are also municipal boards, local boards, which are supposed to be the 4th layer of the government, but they are not. These local boards don't have any prerogative for island policy. They don't have bank accounts, etc. So we are talking that they are completely dependent on their municipalities. We are talking about regions here, which means that we are not addressing a particular issue in the region. We have to address the region as a whole, which means that it then appears in all its richness and in all its complexity. So one would think that whoever addresses the island policy should have that in mind. But this is not a question, because each and every policymaker in the country addresses a certain issue on islands. So it's not only 3 government levels, it's also the 10 out of 9 out of 16 ministries. They have some business on islands. And then this is not all. This is not all, because there are also other important players, those Croatian forests, etc. These facilities, they are important players here, different funds, etc. And there is the Slovenia shipping company, which has a monopolistic position, and it's quite a question whether islanders decide about lines, or is it this shipping agency that decide about in the name of islands but without consulting them. And of course, there's the unavoidable Croatian Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And if we really want to put a right question, it is about the coordination. Are all these policy players, policy leaders, are they coordinated or not? And it is very hard to grasp, because coordination is in particular laws, because every public utility is handled according to the law, and laws say that they should coordinate. They have statutes that also claim that they will coordinate, and in practice they don't, but it's hard to scope level of coordination because no one really takes care of that. There's no any points on the entire pyramid of the state structure that takes care of coordination, and there's no indicators, etc. So the best that we can do is to follow the money. This is an old advice. And well, every year, 1.6 billion kuna has been invested on islands or spent on islands and other. This is about 212 million euros. And on the average, and in 2016, which is kind of a representative year, 1.7 billion was spent, then only 120 million of kuna, 7% only were invested or spent by the ministry. The rest was spent without, by all these other ministries and other subjects and policy players, and with hardly any coordination. What the ministry does is the following: they invest in infrastructure projects. They pay water subsidies for islanders that don't have water on the islands, so it has to be brought to the water areas. And there's a free public road transport, and there is a, if you are an island, to produce something on an island, and you can prove that it's a genuine island product, you get a label by the ministry that it's a Croatian island product, which is supposedly then good for your marketing. And then, of course, the main question that is put here, come on, is it the law? The ministry will say, well, yes, it is. We have our budget item and we always spend it to the last step. Is it enough? Islanders would say, no, it's not enough. Of course, we need much more. And it's quite a contribution to the discussion about the geography of income tax that we have the last couple of hours ago. And the islanders so when it's not enough. It's too little, they would say. And if you pose the question too much, the islanders will cry out loud that it is, of course, not too much because it's too little. That's not all that we can say here as that these are wrong questions. Of course. Right questions would be if this money is spent in the developmentally developed places and ways and is ineffective. And again, we don't have indicators, so we cannot tell much about it. So it's it kind of remains in the air as a question, and it brings us then to this question whether European money will do any difference here, will it change the situation. This is a nice copy of an island newsletter of the one Northern Archipelago of Roshi. It's from 2011, and it's in the European Union, yes or no, and it's a great discussion and a lot of skepticism. There are the same archipelago, 2011 years later, and it's there is a lot of solar panels there. There are other investments on smaller islands within the archipelago, and it is all European money. It is all there, so it would be interesting to ask them again, should we get this discussion about yes or no again. And since we don't have indicators, the best we can do is to try to improve developing shift on islands. Of course, ICT technologies to bring some change. European Union and European structural investment funds, they provided for more public investment, of course. We have more diverse tourism due to sea cruises and this new sort of a new species of tourism nomad. Pandemic and global lockdown is going down the tourism, but only temporarily. We have now provided solutions with renewables, etc. And there is one of the questions about did islands get rich? And you better don't ask them. You better don't ask them because they claim that they have not, although it is quite obvious that they have. But okay. Is it could all these shifts can be addressed to the island policy, or they would have happened anyway, which is quite a question, because all the same question, and we have no way to really answer that here. The best we can do is to try to do some scenarios and try to kind of bypass this question and allow for some methods for planning, and let's hear about them.
Because we are over time, so we have 1 minute, and I will not present the scenario. We'll talk about them in the next conference, and we plan to come to Ljubljana for sure.
Sorry, I thought you were
Yeah, no, but I would like to thank Andre for sure for the recommendation he gave a few years ago when I participated in the team for strategic planning in Europe. So we set up an institutional system from the top to the bottom, and it's one of the 5 cases was the national island development policy. And here we are now in a particular spot in time where the EU structural funds will be of great support for the national island development policy. We're working on this issue for NIMET since 1997 officially, and for 25 years, a lot of time was invested in the strategic planning framework, bottom-up place-based approach. All these aspects were covered through policies and regulations and practices. But what we ended up with all these questions because we have difficulties with the administrative territorial setup of the islands. They do not follow the state system, and you cannot you cannot follow and monitor and evaluate island policy based on statistical data because they do not fit the territory. And I was struggling for at least 2 years with the international consultants coming from the World Bank, coming from Europe, from different places of the world. And they couldn't understand this difficulty that we had here. So what we wanted to do with this presentation, we wanted to introduce scenarios, storytelling. I was really happy to see in the first presentation that storytelling as an approach is very interesting for considering long-term development and setting up long-term targets, and then seeing in which direction development can go. So I'll just run through the rest of the slides just to show you the last one. We were developing scenarios, best case, worst case, some gray area scenarios to find actually a scenario for setting vision, and then go backwards in time and see how we can set up development targets for our medium-term strategic plans. So these are things we want to develop further. We will write it up. We will write it up also in an historical way, and set also some methodological thoughts about the use of scenario planning, and see how this will add up with the new integrated territorial program and all the EU funds which will come in for the island development. So thank you for your attention, and this was our last message in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes to keep some questions.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much for the presentation. You highlighted the whole issue about the European funding, and now the European Union is betting massively on the green and digital transition. And you put an image of solar panels, I suppose in Crest, but it might be in any other island.
Yes,
okay, so and there the issue is these are islands that massively depend on tourism. To what extent do you see a compatibility between promoting the green transition agenda on the islands and the mainstay of the people living there, and whether that's not going to lead to perhaps conflict and clashes in the islands?
Question there?
Actually, my question is a bit related to what was just asked. I was wondering whether there was any process for citizen participation into the decision-making of strategy.
Okay, we have another question.
So being here region, it's very important to recognize that islands are the places where people are being much more to associate. The level of social capital there is on a higher level, and in some cases even civil society organizations are replacing local authorities, delivering different services and promoting certain innovative EU ideas and EU project that somehow might be complementary to the issue. And other important our stakeholder in islands who once I told you are church. Church are very important institution there in digital aspect.
And thank you. I will try to combine in one answer. So the digital and the green agenda are top issues for island development, especially for those who are struggling with conflicting interests in this place. The Telephone machines are very popular, touristic popular places, and there you will see really the conflict going on when you're planning, because the tourism master plan will be funded by the hotel industry from the island and the tourism boards, while the local communities will just stand by and watch what is going on because the capital is concentrated in a big conference. Concerning what was your question? Just about citizen participation. In the strategic planning framework, we have the bottom-up approach integrated also in one hand through working groups, participating in working groups when deciding on definition of problems and doing the SWOT analysis, and then building up local development strategies. And we have also the public consultation process, which is defined by law, so each strategic document has to go into public consultation. So this is the formal part of the whole participation. But when we want to talk about how to involve civil society and citizens, then we actually stop at the formal part of the who's running these processes, mostly regional development agencies, local towns, town administration, and they have difficulties in communicating directly with the citizens when collecting directions and guidance for development. So in that sense, we do have often the opportunity to facilitate such processes or evaluate what we're doing now at the machine. We are proposing to organize meetings with the municipal boards, because they are the local people who are living there and who have really stake in development. So there are many issues going on, especially the integrated coastal zone management approaches, which are proposed also at international level with the UN. And we are kind of now in the middle of everything going on at the same time. And I think this is a good time for island development because of the opportunity for funding, but we have to do it in a wise way. I don't want to use the word smart. We don't really need sensor technology like Mountain Islands and traffic lights, which were proposed in some strategic plans done by foreigners. So it can be something to do with. So if I answered more or less, we can talk tomorrow also or in contact. There
was a question about conflict, so I'd like to answer. Is there, okay.
It should, because the audience online.
Whenever we have these participation meetings on island, we propose smart islands, and the usual answer is, well, we have been stupid so far, and there's no reason to know. So I agree. We better don't. It's smart not to talk about smartness. But for these conflicts, fortunately, production of electricity by solar plants, so it does not conflict with tourism, at least not in space, because it all takes place, all the installations are built in the middle of the island, where of course the island coast is, where tourists come. What does conflict and the congestion of is that transport and tourist peaks and ferries are heavily loaded and overloaded. And of course, the question of solid waste and the sewage. This is where the conflict, conflicts really appear. And this is, I don't know a single island where this can be really solved. That's the point.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks.